DOS had many classics like Jazz Jackrabbit, Commander Keen, and Rayman. But today, we're focusing on 7 forgotten platformers. Quick note before we begin. These games aren't necessarily masterpieces, but they're definitely not toxic junk either. Cold Dreams is a platformer with heavy use of color gradients and a very distinctive early 90s PC atmosphere. As a platformer, it doesn't reinvent much. Every stage is basically a small maze filled with gates you need to open, dumb enemies walking back and forth, and an overall feeling of, haven't we been here before? Even the weapons, like the dagger and whatever that square thing is supposed to be, aren't exactly original either. But maybe because the developers didn't try to design an overly sophisticated game, and because the level design sometimes feels almost random, the game ends up having a kind of charm that's hard to find in tighter platformers from studios like Epic Games, id Software, or Apogee Software. And here's a quick tip from me. Don't waste your time trying to shoot while standing on ladders. It only works if you do this weird, clunky jump off them first. In many ways, Electroman feels similar to Cold Dreams, even though Electroman came out several years earlier. It also uses a similar color palette, and the enemies aren't exactly geniuses either. But unlike Cold Dreams, the controls are much stiffer and closer to games like Jill of the Jungle or Zargon. One thing you absolutely can't take away from the game is its difficulty. The 7 levels are huge and confusing, and since you die after just one hit, surviving for long feels incredibly difficult even with your weapon fully upgraded. You can save freely between checkpoints, thankfully. Good luck actually finding those checkpoints, though. Luckily, the game does include cheat codes, and they're even bundled with the version you can download from GOG. Unfortunately, the game doesn't run at the correct scale by default. So if you want to play it pixel perfect, you'll need to tweak the DOSBox configuration file, or launch it through a different DOSBox setup. Inner Worlds might look like just another average platformer with a female protagonist, but it's much more than that, combining simple controls with surprisingly complex mechanics. For example, you can spend mana to transform into a wolf that runs faster and can literally bite enemies. But if you run out of mana, you won't be able to turn back into a human until you find more. There are also items you can store and activate using the function keys, like invincibility potions or potions that restore your normal size after the game shrinks you against your will. Visually and sonically, Inner Worlds is also really impressive. The mod soundtrack honestly wouldn't feel out of place next to some of the best Amiga game soundtracks of the early 90s. And the game even throws in pseudo 3D visual effects here and there. Still, there are 2 annoying things worth mentioning. First, you'll need some time to get used to the slightly slippery controls, especially while playing as the wolf. And second, watch out for the black holes, because they're actually teleporters. The game costs about $3 on Steam, and just a few days ago, the creators announced they're working on a remastered version. Hopefully they can improve the engine a little bit, because this game genuinely deserves another chance. If the NES had Ninja Gaiden and the Commodore 64 had The Last Ninja, then PC had Shadow Knights. It was created by 2 guys named John Carmack and John Romero. Maybe you've heard of them. Your main weapons are, unsurprisingly, a magical ninja star and a sword, giving you both ranged and close combat attacks. And exactly as you'd expect from the work of the 2 Johns, the scrolling and movement in this game are incredibly smooth. Unfortunately, that's not something I can demonstrate perfectly through DOSBox, so you'll just have to trust me that this thing ran beautifully even on my old 286. And yes, I realize this is becoming a recurring theme here. Shadow Knights is hard. Possibly the hardest game we've covered so far. Especially because your healing magic is tied to your ninja stars, and the panic mode that throws stars in every direction can drain most of your magic bar surprisingly fast. The washed-out color palette that somehow makes certain ZX Spectrum games look vibrant, combined with wild dogs charging at you from every direction, really doesn't help either. But like most games from the glorious Softdisk, id Software, and Apogee Software lineage, the game does include cheat codes to save your sanity. They change depending on the release version, but both versions let you skip levels. To sum it up, great game, if you're actually up to the task. Fury of the Furries was a huge hit on the Amiga, but the DOS version has nothing to be ashamed of either. The story behind the game is actually pretty interesting. It originally launched on both platforms, but later got re-released as Pac-in-Time with a Pac-Man skin. The only version that was truly different was the Super Nintendo release, which had completely different level design and visuals, despite keeping similar mechanics. Even with Namco backing it, the game's late 1995 release probably turned it into a fairly obscure title. You can still play it as a part of Pac-Man Museum Plus, although several cutscenes were changed. I also recommend watching Retro Sutra's video comparing all the different Pac-in-Time versions. And after that short history lesson, let's talk about the actual game. As the title suggests, you control 4 tiny furry creatures, each with different powers. The yellow one shoots fireballs from its mouth, while the green one can latch onto objects using spiderweb-like abilities. The red one can eat certain surfaces, and the blue one can dive underwater and shoot bubbles. You can't always switch freely between all of them, and certain gates disable or reactivate specific colors, but the game is designed in a way that never really leaves you stuck. Fury of the Furries starts as a fairly simple platformer, but later levels turn it into something much closer to a puzzle game, with challenges that will genuinely make you stop and think. Still, it's not Braid. It's also worth mentioning that even though the PC version is limited to ad-lib music and fairly basic Sound Blaster effects, the game still includes 2 different soundtrack sets. And personally, I think it uses this relatively primitive hardware extremely well, even if it can't really compete with the incredible Amiga soundtrack. There's definitely an adjustment period when it comes to the movement and mechanics, because the game can feel a little janky at times. There are also occasional collision detection issues, with hitboxes that sometimes feel the size of a refrigerator. But these are the kinds of problems you eventually learn to work around. And interestingly enough, at one point the original creator wanted to make a sequel. It still appears on Steam, but there haven't been updates in years, so I wouldn't expect news anytime soon. Although even a proper remaster for modern hardware could be fantastic. And to sum it all up, if you only try one game from this video, this is probably the one I'd recommend the most. Charlie the Duck is a DOS game that, surprisingly enough, has continued receiving updates ever since 1996, although now as a legacy version. And yeah, that's still an impressive streak no matter how you look at it. The game is basically the simplest Mario clone imaginable. You jump on enemies while bouncing your way from the beginning of each level to the end. One thing you absolutely can't take away from the game is its beautiful visuals, and the feeling that it was made by people who genuinely loved the platforming genre. The early stages are fairly easy, but things become noticeably more challenging once the game starts expecting you to use dashing for long jumps. And this is where the differences between the DOS and Windows versions become pretty interesting. The Windows version is more stable overall, but also slightly less smooth. It also has music that the DOS version simply doesn't have. According to the game's creator, the technical reason is that the DOS version runs at 70 frames per second, while the Windows version runs at 60. On the other hand, the Windows release doesn't have the annoying dashing issue, and the controls feel more precise overall. So there's always some kind of trade-off. All in all, Charlie isn't an amazing game, but for a lot of people, nostalgia probably does a lot of the heavy lifting here.
Challenge of the Ancient Empires is part of the Super Solvers line by the Learning Company, and one of the few entries that genuinely feels like a real game instead of educational software. Your goal is to travel through different regions around the world and collect all the artifacts. You can start in any area you want, although the zones are still arranged by difficulty. To move between rooms in each chamber, you use 3 special gadgets: a helmet that fires laser beams capable of bouncing off objects like crystals, jumping shoes, and a temporary shield. Since the game is aimed at kids, the puzzles aren't especially difficult. Most of them revolve around pressing switches or touching ancient letters to open gates. Sometimes, like you can see here, you can also take advantage of enemy behavior to solve certain puzzles. The game isn't exactly easy, but it's nowhere near as frustrating as the educational Rayman games. After every chamber, you solve a small puzzle. The game saves your progress, and in certain areas, you can even move ahead a little to understand how to collect artifacts later on. The controls aren't perfect, and like many older DOS games, there's a certain amount of input lag. The best strategy is simply to take your time and remember that very little in the game is actually random. Practice makes perfect, at least on the standard difficulty setting. Challenge of the Ancient Empires is one of those rare educational games that I could genuinely imagine parents still playing together with their kids today. And it's probably better than a lot of modern educational phone apps that mainly exist to drain your money and battery life. I hope you enjoyed the video. Feel free to subscribe or give the video a like.